So for week 7, we're asked if humans can be happy even when going through a life event that causes suffering. And I think initially there's two ways to look at this. We can look and say that it's okay to suffer. It's okay if you're feeling sad and if you're suffering to go through the stages of grief. And eventually that's going to resolve. So you don't have to be happy right away while you're in the middle of suffering. You can take that time to mourn. It's normal to go through a mourning process. And eventually happiness will come back to you if you complete the stages of grief. Or we can look at it another way, which is mentioned by the man in the TED Talk who seems to be a psychologist. He focuses a lot on cognitive theory, which is changing the way you see your reality. So changing that lens in which we look through. So a lot of the time this focuses on changing negative distortions in your thought and changing your outlook and perspective. It's really hard when you have a mental illness like depression or some sort of developmental disability to look at it this way, but for the average person, we can focus on changing the way we see things through that lens. But in the TED Talk, he really says to focus on happiness because I think it's part of the human condition to focus on things that make us unhappy. We do a lot of complaining as a whole, and he mentions medical school syndrome, which is when you go to medical school and for the first year you figure out all the things wrong with you, and he mentions how his brother-in-law says, "Oh, I have leprosy," and they just focus on all the negative things that could be going wrong with them. So a way to be happy when we're suffering is to focus on the good things. You know, everything happens for a reason. Even if you're suffering, try to find that silver lining in what's going wrong. Now, there's a theological truth to suffering and Christian suffering because Jesus suffered for us to be sin-free and to be free of our original sin. And if you think about it, none of us are really going to suffer as much as Jesus did. It's very subjective, but think about it. He got nailed to a cross and was left there to starve and die. But I found a really good article. It talks about 5 truths of Christian suffering, but it starts off by saying, through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. This reality is a stark reminder that we have not reached the new heavens and the new earth. He also says, but just because we experience suffering as we await the redemption of our bodies, it doesn't mean that our suffering is random or without purpose.